What happens when a black woman walks into a courthouse calm, dignified, and qualified only to be treated like a threat instead of a judge? What happens when the people sworn to uphold justice humiliate her before they even ask her name? And more importantly, what happens when they find out the woman they tried to break is the one person with the power to dismantle everything they've built? This isn't just a story about abuse, it's about exposure. It's about what changes, what must change when dignity doesn't back down, and justice puts on a new face. Stay with us. You're not ready for how this ends. And if you believe respect should never depend on recognition, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? It began like any other morning. The sun had just broken through the mist hanging over downtown Bay Ridge, casting pale gold light against the neoclassical columns of the Bay Ridge Federal Courthouse. The streets were quiet, dignified, as though they understood the weight of the law that lived within those walls. Judge Ariel Hayes stepped out of her car and adjusted the collar of her tailored navy coat. In one hand, she held a slim leather portfolio. No robe, no entourage, just her, in quiet command of herself the way she had always entered buildings like this. Not as a figurehead, but as a citizen, calm, composed, observant. But today her presence was mistaken for something else. At the main security checkpoint, the shift in energy was immediate. Deputy Travis Milner, mid-50s, thick-necked and barrel-chested, spotted her from across the lobby. His eyes narrowed as she approached. He didn't recognize her. More importantly, he didn't want to. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward with a gloved hand raised, "I'm going to need you to step out of line." Ariel paused for only a moment, the look in her eyes measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" Milner's eyes scanned her, the silver coils neatly twisted along her scalp, the smooth professionalism in her posture, and the quiet confidence that clung to her like dignity itself. And that precisely was the problem. She looked like she belonged. And in his world, black women weren't supposed to. "No ID displayed," he muttered. "You can't just walk into a federal building dressed like that." Ariel said nothing. She calmly reached into her coat and produced her federal credentials, a judge's badge, gleaming in the light. Milner gave it a cursory glance, then, without hesitation, slipped it into his pocket. "I'd like that returned," she said quietly, her voice even. He stepped closer, close enough that his breath hit her cheek. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word landed like a slap. A second officer, a younger woman, shifted uncomfortably near the X-ray machine but said nothing. "I need to get to a courtroom," Ariel stated firmly. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Milner snapped, his grip suddenly firm on her upper arm. Without warning, he steered her away from the public checkpoint and down a narrow hallway. The air grew cooler, the lights dimmer. A side room loomed ahead, windowless, sterile, with a single metal chair and a tray of scanning equipment. Ariel stopped at the threshold. "I do not consent to this," she said. "You have no legal cause to detain me." "You're acting suspicious," Milner replied flatly. "That's cause enough." Two more guards entered, flanking her. One grabbed her wrist. Another positioned himself behind the chair. Milner reached for a pair of clippers. "What are you doing?" Ariel asked, her voice low and tight. "Standard protocol," he smirked. "You could be hiding something in that mop." Before she could move, the clippers buzzed to life. The cold vibration met her scalp, and with one pass, a thick coil of silver hair dropped to the floor, then another, and another. She didn't scream, she didn't blink, but inside, something began to burn deeper than rage, sharper than humiliation. It was the kind of fire that doesn't die quietly. "She looks better already," one of the guards murmured. Milner stepped back, wiping stray strands from his sleeves. "Now you look more presentable." Ariel said nothing. Her fists clenched in her lap. Her breath was slow, deliberate. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Milner only chuckled. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was who she really was. And in just a few minutes, that truth would bring a courthouse to its knees. The hallway outside the courtroom was quieter than usual. Not silent, just tense, the kind of quiet that hums in the walls and settles in the lungs like smoke. Judge Ariel Hayes walked it alone, her heels clicking softly on the marble, each step steady, deliberate. She did not touch the raw patch above her left ear. She didn't adjust the uneven remnants of her silver hair. She didn't smooth her blazer. She simply moved forward with the poise of someone who had lost none of herself, even as others had tried to strip her bare. At the double doors to courtroom 3B, she paused. The faint murmur of voices carried through the heavy wood attorneys chatting, reporters whispering, clerks organizing files. This morning's session was a high-profile one, a misconduct hearing against 3 local officers accused of brutality during a protest. The city was watching. Ariel was supposed to enter through the back chambers, quietly, with decorum, robe already on, staff already prepared. But not today. Today she reached for the main doors and pushed them open herself. The sound cut the room in half, heads turned, conversation stalled. One of the defense attorneys actually dropped a pen, and then they saw her, a black woman, no robe, no escort, her hair freshly and cruelly shorn in patches, walking alone through the very courtroom they assumed she'd never control. Every eye in the room followed her, some in confusion, some in disbelief, some in dawning horror. The clerk at the front desk blinked as she approached. "Your Honor," she stammered. Ariel didn't respond. She simply walked past the bar, past the attorneys, past the witnesses and spectators, until she reached the tall leather chair behind the bench, the one that only one person in that room had the right to occupy. She didn't wait for ceremony. She didn't ask for silence. She slipped the black robe from its hanger and draped it across her shoulders in one slow, deliberate motion as if donning armor. Only then did she speak. "Is the docket prepared?" The clerk nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." Ariel took her seat. The courtroom held its breath. Even Deputy Travis Milner, now stationed at the side of the gallery, stood frozen, his jaw slightly unhinged, the color draining from his face. He didn't move. He didn't blink. For the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do. Judge Hayes did. She opened the file before her without fanfare. Her voice, when it rang out again, was calm, even. "We will begin with preliminary testimony in case number 0416C, United States versus Bay Ridge Police Department. Charges include abuse of authority, use of excessive force, and violation of civil rights." She did not look at Milner. Not yet. But the silence that wrapped around her wasn't just respect, it was reverence. Not because of her title, not even because of her power, but because they had tried to break her, and she was still standing. Court resumed after the second witness. The gallery was hushed. Not out of routine, but from a strange collective tension. Something unsaid hung in the air, waiting, like the moment before lightning strikes. Judge Ariel Hayes sat still behind the bench, her hands folded gently on the docket, her face unreadable. Then she spoke clear, clipped, deliberate. "Deputy Travis Milner," she said. "Step forward." The room froze. Milner, still standing near the side exit, looked like he hadn't heard her, but he had. His jaw twitched. His boots didn't move. "Deputy Milner," Ariel repeated, sharper this time. "You will step forward, now." The bailiff at the opposite door glanced over. All eyes turned toward the man who just hours ago had held buzzing clippers to her scalp. Milner walked stiffly to the center of the courtroom, each step echoing across marble and wood. His face was flushed. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now sagged with something much closer to fear. "State your name for the record," Ariel commanded. He hesitated. "Travis Milner. How long have you worked in this courthouse?" 17 years, he mumbled. She nodded once. "In that time, how many complaints have been filed against you?" His throat worked. "None that I know of." Ariel's gaze sharpened. She turned to her clerk. "Ms. Patel, please enter into the Record Exhibit 17A, a sealed memorandum from the Office of Court Oversight detailing formal complaints made against Deputy Travis Milner." The clerk opened a folder and passed copies to both tables. "Exhibit 17A," Ariel continued, "documents 12 separate complaints against Deputy Milner over the last 9 years. Allegations include unlawful searches, verbal intimidation, inappropriate physical contact, and racial profiling. All of them buried. All of them dismissed, until today." The gallery gasped. One woman near the back covered her mouth. An attorney leaned back in his seat, stunned. The reporters began scribbling furiously. Milner stammered, "Your Honor, some of those weren't even real complaints. People exaggerate." "Be silent," Ariel said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She stood slowly, her robe falling clean over her frame like black steel. "You humiliated me this morning. Not because you knew who I was, but because you didn't. Because in your mind, a black woman walking through the courthouse lobby couldn't possibly sit on this bench." Milner's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't check my badge. You didn't pause. You presumed. And that presumption, that unchecked arrogance, has left a trail of harm stretching nearly a decade." She paused, then looked to the court officers standing at the side. "Effective immediately, Deputy Travis Milner is relieved of duty. Place him under arrest. charges to include civil rights violations, unlawful detainment, and assault of a federal judge. The officers moved. One stepped behind Milner, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. The other waited, watching. Milner turned pale. "Wait, this isn't how it works." "It is now," Ariel said coldly. The cuffs clicked shut. His badge was removed, his radio silenced. And as he was led out through the same doors she had walked through earlier, the room didn't cheer. It didn't move. It simply watched. Justice, for once, wasn't hidden in backroom deals or procedural footnotes. It was happening in real time, and everyone had seen it. The courtroom remained still long after Deputy Travis Milner had been led away in handcuffs. Not out of shock, but revelation. It wasn't just that a judge had been assaulted. It wasn't even that a powerful man had finally been held to account. It was that for the first time in years, someone had refused to stay silent, and others could finally breathe. Judge Ariel Hayes didn't call the next witness right away. She sat, composed, watchful, listening, because something in the room had shifted. It started small, a stir at the back row, a whispered exchange between two court clerks, the trembling hands of a young woman rising from the gallery. "Your Honor?" she said softly, stepping forward from the benches. Ariel turned. The girl was no older than 22, glasses still fogged from rushing inside. An intern, her badge lanyard slightly twisted, her fingers twisting with it. I was there this morning," she said. "By the checkpoint. I saw what he did." Ariel nodded once. "Please state your name." Megan Cho." Her voice quivered but didn't break. "I didn't stop it. I was scared, but if you need a statement, I'll give one. I'll testify if you need me." "You've already done something most never do," Ariel said gently. "You've spoken." The room was silent again, but this time expectant, waiting. And then, from the opposite side of the gallery, another voice emerged. "Your Honor," came the low baritone of an older man near the doors. He wore the Navy uniform of courthouse custodial staff, patches faded from age. His face was lined, his eyes steady. "I've cleaned that screening room for 17 years, he said. "I've seen women come out of there crying, pulling their shirts back down, holding their heads. Most didn't say anything." "Name?" Ariel asked. "Leon Edwards." "Mr. Edwards," she said. "Thank you. If you're willing, we'll take your statement, under oath." He gave a firm nod, as if he'd been waiting all this time to be asked. The gallery rippled. Something was unraveling, not in chaos, but clarity. Then, from the clerk's desk, her assistant stood. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "Camille Boston has just arrived. She says she worked in records for over a decade and she asked if she could speak with you directly." Ariel's eyes sharpened. "Bring her forward." The doors opened. A woman in her late 50s stepped in, shoulders squared, blazer neat, hair pulled into a tight bun. She carried a single worn folder in her hands, but her presence was heavy with history. "I'm Camille Boston," she said once she reached the witness stand, "and I kept the files." A quiet gasp swept the courtroom. "What files, Ms. Boston?" Ariel asked. Camille opened the folder. 12 complaints against Deputy Milner. Some signed, some handwritten, all marked resolved. None were ever reviewed. I filed them into archives as instructed, but I made copies. Her voice didn't tremble. It cut like a blade. And it wasn't just him. There were others, officers, deputies, some in robes, people who learned how to bury misconduct under procedural code. Every time I raised concerns, I was told it wasn't my place. And why speak now? Camille looked straight at Ariel. Because today, someone in that chair reminded me we don't serve positions. We serve truth. A beat passed. 2. Then Ariel said quietly, "Submit those copies into the record. Effective immediately, this court recognizes their relevance in triggering a formal review." And with that, the first wall of protection crumbled. What began as one woman's humiliation had now cracked open a decade of buried voices, and they were no longer whispering. By mid-morning the next day, the seal of the Department of Justice appeared on official letterhead delivered straight to the chambers of Judge Ariel Hayes. A federal review had been launched, immediate, unrestricted, and public. Byridge Federal Courthouse, once the granite-faced pillar of authority, was now ground zero for what one news anchor called a reckoning long overdue. Inside the clerk's office, reporters lined the corridor. 2 DOJ investigators in gray suits entered quietly through the side entrance, escorted by U.S. Marshals. and in chambers across the building, retired judges, former administrators, and senior officers were already making phone calls not for guidance but for lawyers. Ariel stood by the window, her silver hair now clipped short, clean, and defiant. She watched the chaos unfold outside as her clerk read aloud the email confirmations. Judge Weldon resigned this morning, no statement. Judge Armand just submitted a letter citing medical reasons. And Chief Magistrate Paul Dunning requested early retirement effective immediately. 3 names, 3 careers, gone before the noon docket. But what shook the building more than any resignation came just after 11:15 a.m., when a man stepped hesitantly into the courtroom, Andrew Langston, former U.S. Marshal, now long retired. He had served at Bay Ridge from 2003 to 2012. For 9 years, he'd kept the peace, worked security for high-profile trials, and walked the same marble corridors in quiet observance. Now he stood in front of a federal judge ready to break that silence. "I came to testify," he said plainly, "because I saw it happen. Not once, not twice, but often. And I said nothing." The courtroom listened, not just with ears, but with generations of pent-up recognition. Langston's voice was gravel and remorse. "Milner wasn't alone," he continued. "There was a culture. You could call it tradition, but it was just power unchecked. He mocked women, targeted black attorneys, searched clerks without cause, and He stopped. I let it pass. I told myself I wasn't part of it, but silence is participation, and today I won't be silent." Ariel met his gaze. She didn't offer comfort, she offered space. "Do you know if complaints were ever escalated to senior judiciary officials?" she asked. Langston nodded grimly. "They were. At least 5 I know of, suppressed, brushed off, told we had to protect the integrity of the court." He shook his head. "But what kind of court has integrity if it sacrifices its people to preserve its image?" Gasps whispered through the gallery. This wasn't just about Milner anymore. It was the system and everyone who had played their role in keeping it spotless on the outside while rotting from within. And as that truth echoed through the building, a shift began beyond the courtroom walls. Legal scholars published op-eds within hours, calling Ariel Hayes a judicial compass in an era of erosion. Students taped her quotes to law school doors. Civil rights organizations demanded broader audits. One retired circuit judge told CNN, "She didn't just issue rulings, she forced us to reckon with who we've protected for far too long." Inside chambers, her clerk whispered, "They're calling it the Hayes Standard now." But Ariel didn't smile, because she hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't sought to be a symbol, she'd just shown up to work, and they tried to destroy her for it. Now the fire they lit had become a blaze they couldn't contain. The storm had passed, but what remained inside the walls of Bay Ridge Federal Courthouse wasn't calm. It was clarity. 3 days after the public hearings and federal resignations, Judge Ariel Hayes walked into courtroom 4B, not to preside over a case, but to introduce a policy that would echo far beyond her bench. The gallery was full again, lawyers, clerks, former staffers who had once walked those halls in silence. News cameras were no longer hiding. They wanted to capture this not scandal, but something that rarely makes headlines, a system choosing to change itself. Ariel stood not behind the bench but at the very center of the courtroom floor, unrobed, unmasked, just herself. She held a single document in her hands. "This," she began, voice measured but ringing with intent, "is called the Hayes Protocol." A hush swept the room. "It began as a conversation," she continued, "then a demand, then a necessity." She paused, scanning the faces before her, young and old, skeptical and hopeful. "It is a formal judiciary policy proposal modeled after the Monroe Mandate, but built with broader reach, deeper enforcement, and one unwavering standard: zero tolerance for racial discrimination within federal courthouses, not in theory, in practice." She stepped forward and laid the document on the clerk's table. "It requires 3 immediate actions," she explained. "First, mandatory anti-bias and anti-racism training for all courthouse staff, including bailiffs, clerks, security, and judges, not once, quarterly, certified, audited. Second, psychological screening and fitness for duty evaluations for all personnel in positions of public authority. Third, automatic federal review of any misconduct complaint involving discrimination, harassment, or abuse of power, no matter the rank, tenure, or reputation of the accused." You could feel it in the air, not just the words but what they represented, an undoing of habits, of unchecked entitlement that had worn a robe too long. From the front row, Camille Boston, the records clerk who had once been told to file it and forget it, nodded, tears in her eyes. Leon Edwards, the janitor, whispered, "It's happening." And from the hallway outside, a young intern named Megan Cho passed out printouts of the protocol to visitors, journalists, and law students eager to understand how policy finally caught up to truth. Ariel's voice softened but deepened as she concluded. "We cannot legislate the heart," she said, "but we can damn sure define the standard. This is not about punishment. It is about prevention. It is about protecting not just the integrity of these halls, but the people who enter them. And if we cannot create a courthouse that sees blackness without fear, that sees womanhood without suspicion, then we do not have a justice system. We have a stage." Silence. Then not applause, but something more powerful. Standing. Not prompted. Not ceremonial. Spontaneous. Earned. The courtroom rose not for her title, but for her courage. That day, courtroom 4B stopped being the place where voices were silenced behind badges and procedures. It became the birthplace of the Hayes Protocol and a blueprint for a new kind of justice. The courtroom was still, not quiet from ceremony, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Deputy Travis Milner, once a fixture of unchecked control at Bay Ridge Federal Courthouse, now stood shackled at the wrists, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. His khaki uniform had been replaced with a standard-issue gray jumpsuit. No badge, no nameplate, no swagger, just a man stripped of the authority he once abused. Judge Ariel Hayes sat high above the room, robed once again, her presence still as stone. Her expression gave nothing away, not fury, not triumph, only clarity. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't rushed or rhetorical. It was deliberate, surgical, final. "This court," she began, "has reviewed the charges against former Deputy Travis Milner. Assault under color of law, deprivation of rights, abuse of authority in a federal facility, violation of civil liberties, conspiracy to suppress internal misconduct reports." Each word fell like a hammer on the marble floor. The courtroom didn't flinch. They had heard the testimony, they had seen the footage. They had watched the unraveling of a man who believed his power gave him immunity, and they were now watching its consequence. "Mr. Milner," Ariel continued, eyes fixed on him, "you carried a badge that was meant to protect. Instead, you used it to intimidate, to humiliate, to harm repeatedly, and with impunity. You silenced voices, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. You mocked dignity, not because it offended you, but because you never believed it belonged to people who looked like me." She paused, then leaned forward, not to scold, but to reclaim. "And yet, here I am, still standing." Milner didn't look up. His eyes flicked downward, jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "This court sentences you," Ariel said, "to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law: 6 years for civil rights violations, 5 years for obstruction of justice, 2 years for abuse of power within a protected federal jurisdiction. No parole, no reduction," she exhaled. "But that is only the legal sentence," she added, her tone darkening with gravity. "Now comes the part that the law does not write, the part that belongs to history. You spent your career deciding who belonged and who didn't, who deserved protection and who deserved punishment. You took pride in reducing people to objects of suspicion, stripping them of worth, of peace, of presence. And now," she said quietly, "you sit in the seat you created for others." No one applauded, no one cheered. They just watched, witnessed. Because justice, when done right, doesn't need volume. It just needs truth. Ariel didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She nodded once to the marshals. "Take him away." Milner was led from the courtroom slowly, the cuffs at his wrists glinting under the courtroom lights. The same corridor he once patrolled now stretched before him like a tunnel of shame. As the doors closed behind him, a kind of exhale moved through the room. Not relief, but release. A quiet undoing of fear. Ariel looked out over the gallery, then down at the empty space where Milner had stood. "This was never about vengeance," she said softly. "This was about accountability. And accountability has been served." Then, without another word, she rose, her robe trailing behind her like a tide, and justice followed in her footsteps. The sentence had been delivered. Milner was gone. But the shift that followed wasn't sudden. It wasn't a celebration or a parade. It was quieter than that and deeper. At Bay Ridge Federal Courthouse, change didn't announce itself with headlines. It revealed itself in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. It began the next morning. Judge Ariel Hayes arrived early, just as she always had, coat buttoned, portfolio in hand, hair now clean-shaven by choice, not violence. She walked through the main entrance instead of the judge's side corridor, and for the first time in years, no one asked her for ID. Deputy Carla Mendoza, newly reassigned to the checkpoint, stepped aside and said, "Good morning, Your Honor," not just with respect, but with a tone that held something more. Recognition, not just of her position, but of her experience. Later that day, in the staff lounge, the janitor Leon didn't just mop around her chambers as usual. He knocked first. "Everything okay in there, Judge Hayes?" he asked. She smiled. "It is." "Good," he nodded, then added, "We got your back now." Not loud, not performative, just true. In courtroom 4B, the clerks who once only nodded now stood when she entered before protocol required. One even brought her tea before a full docket, unasked. Another placed fresh flowers near the bench, a quiet gesture in a room once sterile and cold. And in the gallery, the stares had changed. They weren't trying to place her anymore, they were trying to understand her. In the days that followed Milner's sentencing, court visitors began arriving earlier not to catch a scandal, but to watch Ariel work. They took notes. They whispered to each other about that judge, the one who had stood, who had spoken, who had stayed. Even opposing counsel acted differently, no longer curt, no longer assuming, because they'd seen what happened when someone tried to strip Ariel of her dignity and how she rebuilt it. One ruling, one word, one gaze at a time. Out in Bay Ridge, the ripples went further than the courthouse. A mural appeared 2 blocks away, painted over an old retaining wall, soft blues, dark browns, and gold. It showed a woman seated behind a judge's bench, her head shaved, her eyes forward, hands open, not clenched, not closed. Someone had painted 3 words above her image. "Truth stands taller." Ariel saw it on her way to work and didn't say a word, but she slowed her steps, and she let herself breathe. A week later, she visited the local high school. The invitation had been casual. "Would you speak to a few civics students?" She expected 20 kids. There were over 200 waiting in the gym. She talked about the law, yes, but mostly she talked about what the law had forgotten. "How we enforce justice," she told them, "means nothing unless we ask, who is it protecting and who is it punishing for existing?" When she finished, a teacher placed a student-made banner into her hands. On it, written in thick blue paint, were the words, "Bay Ridge listens now." That night, Ariel sat on her porch in silence, not the kind that comes from exhaustion. The kind that comes when a room once built to erase you now echoes with your voice. Change had begun, not through law, but through witness, and one woman refusing to disappear. The Hayes Protocol was never meant to go national. It started as a necessity, a line drawn in the marble floor of Bay Ridge Federal Courthouse, carved not by ambition, but by principle. But justice has a way of traveling. Within weeks, courthouses in Baltimore, Sacramento, and Cleveland quietly adopted versions of it. Internal memos used its language. Training handbooks quoted its phrases. One federal circuit judge from New Jersey called it a reckoning dressed in policy. And yet, Ariel Hayes didn't speak of any of that publicly. She didn't give interviews. She didn't sit for magazine profiles or accept invitations from legal think tanks. Instead, she said yes to a handwritten letter from a 7th grade civics teacher. The school was small, Clara Barton Middle, tucked between an auto shop and a Baptist church. The gymnasium floor creaked. The PA system buzzed like an old fly trap. But when Judge Hayes walked in, the room stilled. It was the same walk she made in court, shoulders square, chin forward, eyes steady. But today, she wasn't behind a bench. She stood in front of 140 kids, some fidgeting, some whispering, all watching. She began simply. "No one told me when I was your age that I could grow up to be a judge," she said. "They told me to work hard, to behave, to be quiet, but they never said, 'You can lead.'" The students listened, really listened. She talked about justice not in theory, but in memory. How it had failed her, how it had healed her, how systems, like people, had to be confronted before they could be reformed. One student raised her hand, a quiet girl in the second row. She looked about 12, her braids tied with mismatched ribbon. Her voice, when she spoke, barely rose above a whisper. "Do you still believe in the system?" she asked. The gym fell silent. Ariel paused not for effect, but because the question deserved an honest answer. I don't believe in what the system was, she said, voice firm but gentle. I've seen too much silence, too much harm covered by procedure and uniforms and legal language. She stepped forward, her tone softening. But I believe in what it can become. I believe in the people who keep asking questions, in those who refuse to look away, in young people like you who don't accept that's just the way it is. A few heads nodded. The girl who had asked the question smiled, just slightly, and that was enough. Later, as Ariel prepared to leave, the teacher handed her a small envelope. Inside were short notes from the students, some drawings, a few words. One simply read, "If you could stand there after what they did, then maybe I can too." Back at the courthouse, the headlines continued. The Hayes Protocol expands to Ninth Circuit. DOJ recommends federal adoption. Judge Hayes invited to speak before Senate Judiciary panel. But Ariel didn't move any faster. She still walked the halls at the same pace, still paused to greet the janitor, still stopped to talk to nervous interns on their first day. She had become the symbol of reform, but she never stopped being present. Because progress, as she knew too well, doesn't happen on podiums. It happens in quiet rooms, where someone dares to ask, "Do you still believe?" And someone else dares to answer, "Yes, but only if we build something better, together." The morning was quiet, the air sharp with late winter's edge. Judge Ariel Hayes stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her fingers tracing the clean curve of her shaved head. The silver stubble was beginning to return, uneven, stubborn, soft at the temples, but she wasn't waiting for it to grow back. She was keeping it this way, not because of what they took from her, but because of what she took back. Across the room, her sister Nadine sat cross-legged on the bed, steaming the hem of Ariel's suit jacket with the same calm care she had shown the day she helped her shave the last uneven strands. "They're not ready for you," she said with a half-smile. Ariel turned, slipping on the jacket with slow precision. "They don't have to be." The Presidential Medal of Justice had never been awarded to a sitting judge before, certainly not to one who had taken her seat hours after being assaulted on federal property. But here she was, preparing for a ceremony in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by senators, scholars, and legal historians who now spoke her name with reverence. Still, she didn't feel like a symbol. She felt like herself. Finally. The room was full when she entered. The president stood to the side of the stage. An orchestra played softly beneath a ceiling glittered with chandeliers. As Ariel took the podium, the applause rose, but it wasn't thunderous. It was deep, steady, respectful. When it faded, she began. "This moment doesn't belong to me alone," she said. "It belongs to the ones who were never given a moment, the women whose complaints were filed and forgotten, the men who were told their pain wasn't real because their skin was too dark or their voice too loud, the children who watched their parents humiliated and thought it was normal. This medal belongs to them." She paused, not for applause, but for silence, the kind that listens. "I didn't ask to become a symbol. I asked to do my job. But when that became impossible without first surviving a system built to erase me, I didn't step back. I stepped forward." She held the medal in her hand, not yet around her neck. Her voice remained steady. "The truth is, I don't wear robes to be respected. I don't shave my head to be seen. I lead because leadership, real leadership, begins with standing where others are afraid to, and staying when the silence tells you to leave." From the front row, Camille Boston, the former records clerk, sat beside Reverend Hill, both with tears in their eyes. 2 rows back, Megan, now a first-year law student, leaned forward, notebook in her lap. A new generation watching. Ariel lifted the medal, paused, and placed it over her own shoulders. A choice. "This doesn't end in a courtroom," she said. "It begins there, but it lives wherever we choose to see one another clearly." As she stepped off the stage, the applause returned, not louder, but fuller. That evening, Ariel walked alone through the Bay Ridge courthouse long after hours. Her heels echoed down the marble hall. No security detail, no press, just her. She passed the old security wing where the incident had begun. It had been rebuilt, redesigned with open glass, new staff, and a placard on the wall. The Hayes Protocol enacted March 12th, Year 1. She didn't stop to read it. She didn't need to. Instead, she made her way to her chambers, hung her coat, and took her seat at the bench. No cameras, no ceremonies, just another day, another docket. Because legacy isn't built in the spotlight, it's built in the quiet return to duty, and that more than punishment, more than medals is what made Judge Ariel Hayes unforgettable. Not that she survived, but that she stood tall, and stayed. What happened inside that courthouse wasn't just about a deputy overstepping his power. It was about a system that protected silence for far too long. Judge Ariel Hayes didn't just reclaim her dignity, she rewrote the rules for how justice must look, sound, and act. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. And now, because of her, others are standing taller: students, clerks, officers, even children, understanding that leadership doesn't come from robes or titles. It comes from truth, and it lasts because it's earned. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that silence can be shattered with grace and systems can change when one person refuses to bend, then share it. Like this video, comment below with the moment that hit you hardest, and subscribe for more stories like this, because justice doesn't live in headlines. It begins with us, right here, right now.